band of members of a so-called religious cult with a leader they call Jesus has had 3 of its followers arrested in the investigation of the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others.
People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone. Women seem wicked when you're unwanted. Streets are uneven when you're down. When you're strange, faces come out.
People often wonder what makes a serial killer kill. Is it childhood trauma, or is it a psychological disorder? This has been a question psychologists have been studying for years. A serial killer is defined as a person who commits a series of murders, often with no apparent motive and typically following a characteristic, predictable behavior pattern. Serial killers have sadly been a part of American culture, especially within the last 50 years. America's first serial killer is said to be H.H. Holmes, who admitted to killing 27 people. The rise of serial killers happened during the 1960s and peaked in the 1980s. Reasons for so many serial killers on the rise were higher rates of crime, the trend of hitchhiking, and making it easier for a predator to prey on the vulnerable. Also, technology wasn't as advanced as it is now, making it easier for killers to get away with their crime. America has always been fascinated by serial killers, but why? During the 1980s, when the term serial killer was a new concept, the government and others took the fear of citizens to capitalize. The FBI was funded by Congress to fight the serial killers, while movies, books, and television series were made about them. One reason America finds serial killers so fascinating is because of Ted Bundy. Bundy was an average American who was looked at as being handsome, charming, and intelligent. However, it is suspected he killed more than 100 women. The disconnect between appearance and reality came to be seen as a defining trait of serial killers, and is one of the main reasons Americans find them so fascinating. People are also fascinated with the psychology behind a serial killer. People wonder what could push someone to kill. Throughout the last couple of decades, shows like Criminal Minds and movies like Silence of the Lambs shows average people what people in the FBI look like when they're trying to find a serial killer. This has also sparked the interest of many. The 2 main reasons that have been researched are past trauma and mental disorders. A great example of a person who murdered because of past trauma is Ed Kemper, also known as the co-ed killer. Ed Kemper was arrested in April of 1973 for the murder of 6 female students, his own mother, and his mother's best friend.
In 1972 and 1973, a series of murders shocked Northern California. College girls began to disappear while hitchhiking. 2 of the victims were picked up from the campus of the University of California at Santa Cruz. That's where Ed Kemper's mother was working as an administrative assistant.
Kemper was smart as a child, but started his psychopathic tendencies at a young age as he would kill and torture animals. During childhood, Kemper was physically and emotionally abused by his mother, who was an alcoholic. She would even lock him in the basement alone. Kemper grew to have a hatred for his mother, and even ran away from his mother at the age of 14. He was sent to live with his grandparents, and he claims that his grandmother also abused him as his mother did. In 1964, when Kemper was just 15, he shot his grandmother in the head and killed his grandfather as well, because he thought his grandfather would be angry with him for what he did. Kemper was put into a mental hospital for the criminally insane and was released into his mother's care less than 5 years after being admitted. Kemper thought about killing his mother, but wanted to perfect his murdering skills. So, between May of 1972 and February of 1973, Kemper killed a total of 6 female students hitchhiking. Kemper killed his mother on Good Friday of 1973, then called the police and admitted his murders.
On Saturday morning, about 5:15 a.m., I killed my mother. At approximately 7:55 that evening, I killed a friend of hers.
At first, the police didn't believe him because they were friends, but then believed him once he told them the disclosed information of the murders. Kemper was found guilty and given a life sentence. The trauma Kemper experienced as a child led him not only just to develop a hatred for his mother, but women in general. All of his victims were women because he despised them because of the abuse his mother put him through. He even said this about his mother. One side of me says I like to talk to her, date her. The other side says, I wonder how her head would look like on a stick. An argument to why serial killers are born the way they are is because of brain scans revealed that psychopathy in the criminals was associated with decreased connectivity between the amygdala, a subcortical structure of the brain that processes negative stimuli, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or the VMPFC, a cortical region in the front of the brain that interprets the response from the amygdala. A study conducted in Madison, Wisconsin, shows a correlation between criminal psychopathy and abnormality of the brain. The brain abnormality is on the majority of cases of psychopathic criminals and is not abruptly acquired. There's a reason to think that it's grounded in the killer's DNA. There are a few limitations to this study, however. First of all, being that not all psychopaths are killer, and the second being that it doesn't show that reduced activity between the amygdala and the VMPFC is an abnormality specifically linked to psychopathy, rather than a range of mental conditions that have been associated with serious crime, including paranoid schizophrenia. Others think that a chromosome abnormality begins to express itself during the teen years, and that is what triggers the serial killers. Another thought is that it can be a degenerative disease that leads to a reduction of the brain's white matter, which is responsible for connectivity among neurons. Unlike Ed Kemper, that had an abusive childhood, Jeffrey Dahmer's childhood was relatively normal until the divorce of his parents as a teenager. He had no known incidents that would have severely traumatized him to the point of him murdering people. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer sought out mostly African American men and would lure them back to his home where he would strangle them. After killing them, he would dismember them, often keeping a few body parts as souvenirs. He would take photographs of his victims at various parts of the murder process and keep them to relive the experience. Dahmer was caught in 1991 and sentenced 16 life terms, but was murdered in prison in 1994. Dahmer started his murderous tendencies at the age of 14 when he would murder and dismember small animals. Throughout his childhood, Dahmer was antisocial and didn't have many friends. He lacked social skills and was emotionally distant. Dahmer's mother was also mentally ill and was distant with her child and apparently took many pills while pregnant with him. During Dahmer's trial, a psychiatrist claimed that Dahmer was psychotic. Dahmer was struggling with mental illness for a while and was also an alcoholic. He was even kicked out of the army for his alcoholism. When Dahmer was murdering people, he had the fantasy of somehow turning them into zombies and indicating an obvious mental illness. Many people link serial killers with the terms sociopath and psychopath, and often get them confused with each other. A psychopath is a person suffering from chronic mental disorders with abnormal or violent social behavior, and a sociopath is a person with a personality disorder manifesting itself in extreme antisocial attitudes and behavior and a lack of conscience. Serial killers often have traits of both diseases, and the two diseases also overlap. Traits that sociopaths and psychopaths share are a disregard for laws and social morals, a disregard for the right of others, a failure to feel guilt, and a tendency to display violent behavior. People also think that serial killers are insane, but to be considered insane, the criminal justice system says the murderer must think that what they have done was not morally wrong. However, psychopathic serial killers such as Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy knew what they were doing was wrong. There is a popular culture stereotype that serial killers are cunning and criminal geniuses. This stereotype is heavily promoted by the entertainment media and television, books, and films. The image of evil genius serial killers comes from Hollywood. Real serial killers generally do not possess unique or exceptional intellectual skills. The reality is that most serial killers who had their IQ tested scored between borderline and above average intelligence. When looking at the two, psychopaths and sociopaths seem very similar. They do share some traits but are very different from each other. Sociopaths are nervous and agitated. They are prone to emotional outbursts and are likely to stay on the outskirts of society. It is very rare for sociopaths to form attachments with others, but however, they are able to form an attachment with an individual, although they have no regard for society. Any crimes committed by a sociopath, including murder, will tend to be haphazard, disorganized, and spontaneous, rather than planned. However, psychopaths cannot form attachments to people, even though they might have a charming personality. Psychopaths are extremely manipulative and will learn how to mimic emotions despite the inability to actually feel them. Psychopaths are usually well educated and can hold jobs, unlike sociopaths. When committing crimes, psychopaths carefully plan out every detail in advance and often have plans in place. Their crimes, whether violent or nonviolent, will be highly organized and generally offer a few clues for authorities to pursue. The cause of both is also different. The cause of psychopathy is a result of genetics, and sociopathy is the result of the environment one grows up in. While there is no surefire way to spot a serial killer before they strike, we know children suffering from trauma are more likely to grow up to be violent and emotionally unstable. It is important to give these victims the help they need before they become the predators. Mental illness causes people's brains to distort their thoughts completely, and certain illnesses can drive people to hurt themselves and others. Thankfully, each generation is becoming more educated on mental illness and are able to understand it is just as uncontrollable as the flu or any external illness. Because of this, there are treatments in places for those suffering from mental illnesses to get the help they needed. Although we will never be able to stop all serial killers as our society advances, we are able to stop and get more people the help they need. Finally, we wanted to interview a few adults about how crime affected them in their generation and what crime was like in their generation as well. So here these are.
Have you noticed an increase of crime in this generation versus your generation?
No, I think my generation had more crime than this generation.
When you were a child, were kidnapping and serial killers a main concern of your parents?
Yes.
Were you warned against hitchhiking and the danger of strangers more or less or the same as kids are today?
I would say the same as kids are today.
Have you noticed an increase in society's concern for child safety?
Yes, I think every parent in every society has been concerned about children's safety, so I think it's about the same.
What impact do you think social media has had on child safety?
Well, I think social media allows children to have a broader network and for more people to understand and get to know children for really no reason other than being on social media.
Do you think you're more aware of your child's whereabouts than your parents were at their ages?
Yes, I think social media and some of the smartphone applications allow the parents to be more aware of where their children are.
Do you think this benefits children?
Have you noticed an increase in crime in this generation versus in your generation?
Absolutely.
When you were a child, was kidnapping a main concern of your parents?
Not at all.
Is kidnapping more of a concern raising kids now than it was for your parents?
Definitely.
How strict were you with how far your children could go on their own?
I wasn't very strict, but we lived in a relatively safe neighborhood.
Does this differ from your parents' rules?
Not at all. My parents were definitely differs. My parents were less strict. We could go miles.
How have you noticed an increase in society's concern for child safety?
Yes.
What impact has social media had on child safety?
Oh, interesting question. I think it's had an impact because there's an opportunity for people to share every detail about safety concerns. And so I think that people tend to overreact when compared to the number of children in the world and the amount of crime committed against children. It's very minute in the grand scheme of things.
Do you think you are more aware of your children's whereabouts than your parents were?
Yes, but because of technology.